Hey, what is up, you guys? It is Kat, and today, again, we have one of my very dear friends, actually, Ms. Stephanie Forbes, who is once again joining us for an illuminating discussion. Stephanie Forbes, if you recall, is a nationally recognized value chain expert with over 20 years of experience steering multi-billion dollar projects across Canada and the United States. As interim vice chair of Supply Chain Canada Alberta Institute, Stephanie is often called upon to share her expertise and knowledge through joining and moderating industry panels, webinars, podcasts, and as an international speaker. Stephanie's value chain knowledge and experience is as wide as it is as deep. She was the main instigator behind the development of Supply Chain Excellence Forum and has worked with some of the largest organizations in North America. Stephanie is passionate and she's exceptionally skilled at complex problem solving in developing programs, best in class governance models for organizations such as Shell, Chevron, TC Energy, Synovus, and much, much more. And so today, welcome back. Ms. Stephanie. Today I'm really super excited because we have been talking about our next sort of episode adventure, what sort of topics would be interesting, really, really interesting to talk about. And we were talking about like fraud, right? And so, I mean, obviously, you are an expert on all things like ERP, particularly in the supply chain space, and and so you see, and you've had experiences working with companies who have fallen to the become victims of fraud. And like when we talk about vendors and when we talk about like cash going out of the company, that's where it is, right? Like you have to pay your vendors, you have to pay your people. And as soon as you have this outgoing cash, these outlets, of course, there are going to be areas for fraud. Now, I understand that you've written a really, really interesting article that you shared with me recently. So let's set the stage and sort of begin with that. So for the people who are not necessarily, like, I feel like everybody kind of understands what has a shallow understanding of what fraud could be. But, let's level set and please help me define what that means for an
Abs-
organization.
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you again for having me on your podcast. It's always a pleasure. And yes, I'm very excited to be here again. So, to answer your question, what is fraud in the procurement sense? So, I define procurement fraud as criminal deception in the procurement of goods and services intended for personal or financial gain or with an intent to manipulate or misinterpret some facts. And so the important piece here is that it's really about that deception in terms of how you're either acquiring it or if you do actually acquire the goods or services.
Deception. Okay, so what is that? Okay, so lies, right?
Yeah, so let's get into it a little bit. So there's different types of procurement fraud, right? So
Mm,
some of the types of procurement fraud I've personally witnessed look like employee contractor collusion or bribery. So that's where you have, a person on the inside and a person on the outside, and they collude together to say, "Hey, you're going to hire my company or my brother's company or my cousin's company." Or I'm going to bribe you with a snowmobile or a fishing trip or something like that so that we can get this contract in place. Um,
really? That too is considered fraud because you
yeah,
think that that's like just like guanxi or like just having a good relationship with that, like networking. No?
no, because you're bypassing like a fair practice,
Ah,
let's say like an RFP,
right.
including other individuals or companies or contractors on the bid, and you're deciding how you want to contract that work through an act of bribery or collusion. So there's no fair
Gotcha.
practice
Right.
that's occurring. And then in fact the outcome might actually be more expensive for your organization because the process of receiving a kickback costs money. And
Mm,
so at the end of the day, that contract that isn't just straight up might end up costing more because you have to then still facilitate the kickbacks or the bribery or the collusion effort, which may look like a whole bunch of different things.
right. And add to that the fact that, that outside company felt that they needed to bribe somebody to get business really does tell you that they don't really stand behind their work. They're not necessarily a quality vendor. And so they have to, amount to these behind the like side table or backroom practices to get work.
Yeah, it continues to be an ongoing issue, and it's something that I've seen is in terms of like a type of fraud, especially with the bribery piece.
How
The next
does
one, sorry.
so go ahead. Well, let's go through all the different types and then we'll kind of delve into each perhaps.
Sure. So the next one would be conflicts of interest. So this it looks like somebody not disclosing that they are related or have a very special relationship with a vendor. So conflicts of interest would look like I'm hiring as an example for a contract, and I hire my sister's company, and and she's a different last name than I do because she's married, and so I don't disclose the fact that that's my sister's organization. And so those conflicts of interest, what happens is we evaluate them differently. And
Mm,
if you are in a conflict situation, even if it's you're at a board level and you have a conflict of interest, you do need to disclose that. And you can still proceed with somebody knowing somebody or having a relation, be hired to do certain work, but you have to disclose the conflict of interest. And if there's any sort of, serious portions of the work that need to be negotiated or managed, you might need to remove yourself as a say, hey, I have a conflict
mm,
here. I can't actually evaluate this contract. Somebody else has to do that because that's my sister's organization. And so then somebody else would come in and do the evaluation, and they may still win and be perfectly fine. But it's the non-disclosing of conflicts of interest that get people into a lot of problems.
right. Okay, so we got collusion, we've got conflict of interest. What's next?
Bid rigging. So
Mm,
this is where you usually a supplier and a person or owner's organization will decide who and how is going to get what work. And so even if you do go out for RFP, a lot of the bidders may come back with a really cost prohibitive price, or they may decline to bid, so that they can basically rig the outcome to be a certain way. So bid rigging always includes multiple parties, and usually in what I've seen is you need an external party on the supplier base and an internal party at the owner's organization to make bid rigging work.
that's crazy. That's crazy. And so,
It
okay,
is
so bid rigging. Okay, so sorry, I might
product
have to edit this
substitution.
part out.
Do you
I'm a
want to
little
start over?
bit.
Do you want to go back to the top for procurement fraud, or do you want to keep going?
No, let's keep going. Let's
Okay.
keep going.
So the next one will be product substitution. So product
Mm,
substitution is a really big deal. We cannot have items being just substituted out because
mm,
they happen to be cheaper. A really good example of this is actually in the oil and gas space when it comes to valves. So for a long time, there has been very stringent requirements around metallurgy, around non-destructive examination or testing, quality controls around how a valve is built and made and where the components come from. Because a number of years ago, what had happened is they had ordered, a large number of high pressure valves, say from, Asia Pac somewhere, and they were substituted. So the same size, the same type, but the metallurgy and other components weren't to spec. And so you had a whole bunch of failures. And in a high pressure environment in the oil and
mm.
gas space, that's very dangerous. And so product substitution, really need to watch for when you start getting into, large quantities of manufactured goods. And so like studs, nuts, gaskets, valves, flanges, like all of those types of commoditized components, it's really important that you understand what the quality requirements and also the component requirements are, because product substitution is not only just dangerous, but there's a lot of money tied up in product substitution.
100%. So my next question is, and I can't help but I just want to dive into one of these. So we're
Let's
going to
get in
start with
there.
this one anyways. So product substitution, now it's my next question, obvious question is how do you determine, like how do you identify when there is product substitution happening? Like I'm thinking of in terms of your quality control processes, but I feel like so for oil and gas companies, as an example,
Mm.
when you do the receipt of the goods, like how much vigor is there really in the quality control on a work site when you got the
Mhm.
goods shipped to it? I
Yeah.
would be inclined to just like go ahead and use it, but there's got to be that QC
Mhm.
involved first.
Yeah, as a part of your material receiving. So when you
Mm,
have your material, your goods come in, you normally have a receiving process that you follow, which deals
hmm
with over quantities, short quantities, damaged
hmm
quantities, as well as product quality testing. So in some cases, you might actually use a little tool to test the components metallurgy.
hmm
You might take it to an on, like say it's on a site, maybe you would take that product to a small area where you would test it, where you would do like a bench test on it to just double
Right.
check a number of things. Does it open? Does it close? Does it cycle? Like what are the things that it needs to do before it gets installed? So there has been a large number of quality control requirements and milestones within the receipt of certain goods that has happened for a large amount of time. And what they also do is at the time of manufacture is you'll hire sometimes third party inspectors to go into that
Mm,
facility and watch those things being made, and maybe they pull every third or fourth one off the line and conduct a series of tests to ensure that it meets certain requirements, and whether that's metallurgy, whether that's how it's been formed or created or made, maybe that's evaluating the quality of a weld, different things like that. So they really have brought in a lot of great quality attestation to make sure that it is 100% what it says it is.
gotcha. Gotcha. So then aside from like on-site quality control, like when you do the receiving and obviously like at the work site, I mean, I feel like at the work site things could get a little bit dicey, right? Like there's so many things that going on in a work site that
That's
I
a good point.
feel like that could be an area where even with the best intentions, you do your quality control. Yeah, 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 it's good, it's good.
Yeah,
Like to get the job done.
100%. And that's why you see it being done at multiple places. You'll see it being done at the factory. You'll
Mm,
see it at time of readiness to ship. You'll see it done again when it gets received, and then you'll probably see it again as it gets installed, depending on what the
right.
component is. So usually, what's happening now is you have a layering effect of quality control activities at different time horizons. And in some cases, you're going to do it, a couple times on an individual product or good. And that's really important because with some of these items, if they fail, it can be very catastrophic. And so, as part of a
Yes,
risk mitigation
100%.
plan, you make sure that you have additional quality layered in to avoid that type of catastrophic risk.
Right, right, right. And I suppose that in addition to, on-site quality control, there is something to be said about documented vertical integration as well. Right? And
Yes.
so what kind of things would organizations look to do if they haven't actually, I mean, I would imagine that many organizations haven't even thought about the extent to which you need to be clear about your vertical integration in your supply chain. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so vertical integration of your supply chain is sort of the next level in your supplier quality and risk management. So if you have a vertically integrated supply chain and you know what's happening in each of the different layers, it reduces your overall risk. It provides you with a little bit more predictability. I'm going to use control and air brackets because we don't have a lot of control, but what we're trying to get to is more predictability, more
Hmm.
assurances. And so the more that we can vertically integrate, the more that we can really understand the individuals and people within each of those tiers, one, two, or three, in terms of your supply chain, the better we can control and adapt when situations do arise. But we can also layer on our expectations. So that's saying things like, here's the quality program, here's the audit program, here's the things that we're going to do on a regular basis, and we're going to work together. So not only do you have a series of expectations as the owner, but your suppliers understand the expectations, and then they have documents and deliverables and audit cycles that make sure that they adhere to those. And that becomes a really crucial part as you navigate sort of your supplier landscape, because
Mm,
once you understand who you're going to work with and what type of rigors you're going to put in, and you put effort into that relationship, you get greater predictability in terms of cost, schedule, quality. And that
mhm.
predictability is ultimately what helps create greater successes within organizations.
Right. Greater reliability, greater transparency,
Yes.
all
And
things.
remember, like, cost is just one component, right? Like
Hmm.
the physical cost is one component. You have so many other components that you have to take into consideration in terms of your total value. And, those are things like schedule, reliability, quality, reputation, and you have to really take a look at the whole picture.
Right. That's interesting. And so, like from a systems point of view, I do know that a lot of this, not necessarily the full scope of quality control and managing your, vendor relationships, that is also partly built into an enterprise resource planning system such that you have a place to document all of these things. And you have a place
Correct.
that, like they need to be recertified at a particular whatever your process is, like that
Yes.
kind of thing, right?
So yeah, so that's where you'd house your compliance data. So your ERP would
Hmm.
house all of your WCB information, so your workers' compensation board in Canada information, your insurance information, your certificates. So maybe you're an ISO certified company, maybe you're an ASME certified company. Depending on the type of organization you run, the products and or services that you sell, those certifications may require annual or some other type of cadence update, and making sure that those things are updated, they're reviewed. If there's an audit cycle, what are the audit findings? How are they closing those gaps? And so there's a whole bunch of nuances within there that if you have a nice, robust ERP or enterprise planning software, you can then house that information in there. So as you're making buying decisions, you can double check that the organization is still meeting the expectations around quality, cost, regulations, all that kind of good stuff.
Right, right. So, okay, so that's on product substitution. Let's go back to bid rigging. I have problems with words today. Words. So again, it was, to be honest, I didn't necessarily follow the full, like, I don't understand bid rigging. Like, how does it, if I were to bid rig something, how would I do it? Not that I need to bid rig.
So here we'll use an example. So I'm gonna hire somebody to implement an ERP in my organization,
Hmm.
and I don't know who that's going to be. And you're like, hey, Steph, I could implement an ERP for you. And I'm like, great. Okay, so let's put this list of people together. And you're like, oh, for sure you should put, these other 5 vendors on there. And I'm like, okay, great. I'll put those other vendors on there. Meanwhile, those other 5 vendors you either know are going to be cost prohibitive, or you've talked to them and told them, this is my client. I need to get this job. Please don't submit a bid. And so between the two of us,
Oh, I
basically,
see.
we've determined that I really just want to work with Kat. We're going to come up with
Gotcha.
a list of 5 vendors. We're going to make sure they either get disqualified or are too costly, or they don't submit a bid, so I can continue to work with you. So you and I rig the RFX process, or the request for quote process, to ensure that the outcome is how we want it to be. And usually it doesn't always involve an external supplier and an internal like buyer in, say, this case that we're giving an example to, but it's the most common that you'd have an external party and an internal party rig the bid to come out a certain way.
Gotcha. Okay, I understand now. I understand now. And so how does what should one be putting in place, like an organization be putting in place to circumvent, like to prevent this from happening?
So in this case, I, as the person putting together the bid list, would say go back to, say, my manager, my leader, my supervisor, and they would go through and go, hey, why are we going with these 5 other ERPs? Like, we know all these other organizations. Why haven't they made the list? And they might go, hey, timeout. I want to do a request for information. I want to see who wants to
Mm,
be party to this, who's interested. So I'm
right.
going to send out a letter and say, hey, we're going to send out an RFP in 3 months for ERP services. Who would like to be involved? And I send them to like 30 or 40, and 20 come back and say, hey, yeah, pick me. And so the organization then would say, okay, from that group, how are we going to narrow it down to a reasonable, field of, say, 5 or 7
Right.
different vendors. But if one person is the only person that makes the decisions around who gets
Mm,
on the bid list, who gets selected, how they get reviewed, and they're able to really control that, then you introduce
mhm.
the option for people to get those people on the outside and say, hey, let's just work together because we like working together.
Right, 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 right. And so where does that, like, how do they make money off of that?
Well, if there's no real competition, right? So then either my first change order is a doozy, which happens quite a bit in bid rigging, where you have, say, maybe that there's going to be changes coming, and so the
Yeah.
original scope comes in at a really low or quite a low value, and
Okay.
then first change order, third change order, etc., and that you have a significant cost increase.
Right, 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 right. And then of course the person who is involved would have probably received part of the kickback or as a kickback or something.
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes there's no kickbacks involved in bid rigging. Sometimes it's just, they really want to work with their buddy. In
Oh,
some instances, it's just
really?
about
People would go to that
they
extent.
oh yeah. Like if you think about, in say the construction space, which I have more familiarity with, certain people just want to work with certain people.
Mm,
Um, and if they're as a group, they all generally do better together
mm.
because they understand how each other work, they enjoy working with each other, etc. So everyone just makes more money on their contracts in general. And so
Gotcha.
bid rigging is not necessarily always results in a kickback, but it results in certain people wanting to work together or deciding how they want to work together. And so you just there, I don't want to say that they're always, there's always a kickback there because it doesn't
Mm.
always appear. Sometimes it can just be people wanting to or choosing to want to work together or choosing to that's how they want to move forward with the program.
Gotcha. Okay, okay. And then probably same thing with the conflict of interest as well. Like there's not
Yeah,
often perhaps a monetary benefit for the person who is committing this fraud, but
it gets really dicey. So the reason conflicts of interest, so if I was sitting on a board of directors and I directed my vice president of supply chain to go ahead and get this contract in place with XYZ company, which happened to be my son's company or my daughter's company, then that conflict of interest is not in the best interest of the organization. And
mm,
so we see that a lot where you have people in positions of power that will make a decision that will say, you're going to go hire this person, you're going to go do X, you're going
right.
to go do Y. And then what usually happens in those initial startings of conflict of interest is you end up in a dicier situation, which could include things like bribery. A really good
Mm,
example of that one, which we're all very familiar with, is SNC-Lavalin. So SNC-Lavalin really leveraged conflicts of interest with people in major positions of power. In some instances, it also included bribery. But what's happening there is there was not the appropriate level of disclosure around conflicts of interest, and
mm.
it continued to precipitate into quite significant bribery.
Right, right. Okay, so going into sort of cases that you have experienced in working with organizations that fell victim
Yes.
to fraud. In your article, you had mentioned a couple of really significant ones. Let's sort of dive into one of those
Yeah.
without sort of divulging anybody. We'll keep the guilty, protected.
Yeah, no, we won't be talking about anyone in specifics other than SNC-Lavalin, which is in the news. So I can talk about that. So one last type of procurement fraud, which is sort of the
Mm,
crux of my stories, is data manipulation. So data
mm,
manipulation is really how we're getting the biggest bang for our buck right now in terms of money out. And data manipulation looks like individuals usually going in and updating or changing or doing something with the ERP data in order to process something or facilitate something in order to get paid. So the first example I have is, and this is why our vendor management processes and your master data management processes are very critical. Who can access them? Who can do what? How many people need to touch something to make sure it's true and valid? Is because when you have individuals working within the ERP that have access to things like the vendor's card, like the vendor data card, which includes
mm-hmm.
things like how much money is getting paid, when are they getting paid? In this particular instance, you had an individual go in, update the wire details. So this is for a wire transfer for an international banking. And they updated the wire details to a different bank than the bank of the organization. About 2 weeks later, there was a $9 million check run for payment for services rendered, which was a legitimate invoice and it was a legitimate fee. And it went to a different wire. And 2 weeks later, they're like, we paid you. They're like, we don't have the money. Okay. And so they start going and trying to track all the details to figure out what actually happened. And that $9 million that was sent to a net new wire was transferred 3 or 4 times to different other international banking institutions. And then it was finally cashed out.
Oh my
And
goodness.
yeah, so you got $9 million that's missing, and two people pointing or two organizations pointing fingers at each other. And at the end of the day, it was an employee of an organization that had gone in knowing that this was going to happen and sent themselves $9 million and never showed up for work.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Insane.
And there's
So let
nothing by the time they figured it out, there's nothing that you could actually do because, to find money in 9 different or 8 different jurisdictions, and then which was ultimately cashed out, like you like
how
the
do
amount
you
of work to go through, like how do
know
you do that? Is
exactly?
that Interpol? Like, and then, it's a lot of resources to try and find that. So it was a very interesting $9 million story. So
That's
this,
crazy. And
yeah,
and add to that that they didn't even discover anything wrong until 2 weeks later. Like a lot can happen in 5 minutes, let alone 2 weeks. So then
yeah.
let's break this down a bit. So like you have this 2 week wait in which the the check is cashed, okay? Then prior to that, you got this employee who has access. So this employee is probably part of the, I don't know, either procurement team or like accounting team, sure.
Or the vendor's accounting person can send a vendor update in.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So
those
so
are all
some
the fail points. Let's identify all the fail points.
Yeah. So the fail points are at both sides of the organization. So both at the vendor side and the owner side. So both sides can update a vendor card's wire details, right? How do you check which wire
Yeah,
details are true, right?
exactly.
What's your
Exactly.
process? And actually, it was interesting after that particular one of the governance methods for any banking changes, because banking changes are very rare in an organization, right? And so if you think of we'll just pick on TC Energy. If you think of TC
Mm,
Energy, if they were to like lock, stock, and barrel change their bank, and now all of a sudden their wire details are different, everyone should have a red flag because they should be receiving a letter from the CFO of TC Energy saying, "Hey, we're updating our banking details. Like the AP team will be reaching out. Here's the FAQ list. Here's like there should be a major piece of messaging saying that somebody's updating their banking details or
banking.
their
Yeah.
bank's changed." And so, if you, in the absence of something that's been issued out by a C-suite officer in an organization or some sort of notification, somebody just getting a hold of you and saying, "Oh, by the way, banking details are updated," that should be a fairly big red flag because that doesn't happen very often.
Mm-hmm.
Think of even
Right.
as an individual, like how often do you ever change your bank?
Yeah, never, pretty much, never. You might
So
add banking, but
you
no,
could add
no, no.
banking,
Like,
yeah. But generally you're not going to change if you have a wire details as an organization. Those wire details are likely not going to change very often, or if they do, there's some sort of big notification around it. So that's kind of a big one in that particular instance. That was a big
right.
one. Well, who can actually change that, and how are we? What kind of due diligence are we practicing?
Right, right, right. And I feel like that's where that would be the major checkpoint is that, somebody's asking or somebody's doing this wire transfer. Now, okay, so here's the thing though, like if I were an employee and I wanted to just go ahead and change the wire transfer, like the legit way is that yes, you're going to be waiting for this CFO, but if I'm really, intent on changing my wire transfer, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I'm not going to tell anybody.
Yeah, so if you are at the owner organization and you're the one in the
Mm,
ERP, you're not the vendor, you're the owner organization. And that's your job is to update vendor details. Yeah, you can just go in and update the vendor card and put the new wire details in. So what's your process around flagging, certain types of
exactly.
data changes, right? And so then, that's a daily, monthly, weekly report of data
Yeah.
changes. And so you're going to say, okay, if anytime there's a banking change or EFT change or wire change or some other change to banking details, that should get flagged in some sort of report that should be
Mm,
reviewed by internal audit or somebody else that's, going to go through and say, okay, wait a minute, like why do we have so many vendor banking details changing, this week? And if you have large outlays of cash, so if you were going
yep.
to say pay a $30 million invoice to a company, you might have additional checks to say, hey, is this the correct wire? Is this the correct this? Is this correct that before you actually issue it out? Some organizations they'll pick a threshold and say, okay, well, anything over $50 million or $30 million, we're going to validate every time before it gets issued, just to make sure that those types of things don't occur.
Right, 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 right. Or would you say, is there, like, if you break the payments into smaller well, I guess that doesn't really catch anything because even, I mean, at the end of the
Mm-mm.
day, all the money needs to go to the right account. anyway, so regardless if it's like
Yeah.
one payment or 15 payments, it's still the money going out the door. And if it's going to the wrong destination, then it's going to the wrong destination, all 15 of them, right?
Yeah. And you don't necessarily want to break up payments, or that's actually another way that you can you in from a PO side, if you had a $10 million PO that you wanted to break up into 10 $1 million POs, so it stayed within a certain delegation of authority guideline. That's
Ah,
also another way to commit fraud, is
right.
by breaking up the volume just so that you sit below the threshold so that you can approve everything,
Right. Right. So then
right?
how would you counteract that?
You run a report. Basically, you pull all your vendors and you'd say, okay, well, why does Bob's Welding Service have 10 POs this month for $1 million each, like with the same project code? This should be
One, right.
one $10 million. And so you would run different reports out of your ERP, and then you would go specifically looking for that. So there's a whole bunch of things that I would look for in a monthly reporting cycle, and that would look like breaking apart the POs to get them to a lower dollar value. That would look like duplicate invoicing. Well, how many of the same dollar value? So you go in and you pick a bunch of different criteria, and you'd specifically go look for it on a monthly basis, and
Mm.
then do your audit checks.
So that's really interesting because okay, so you had identified where that checkpoint is, right? And that's like running a report that shows you, in this example, we've got like 10 POs going to the same project, which really should be rolled up into one so that it
Yep.
would go through the rigor of the approval hierarchy.
Yep.
But no, I feel like running that report, if you don't train your team to ask the right questions,
Yes.
to look like they won't know what to look for, right?
Yeah.
They'll be like, "Oh, well, there's 10 POs. Okay, that's a big project."
That's why it's so important to train your staff, right? And to have regular meetings where you sit down and you go through findings and best practices and governance models and things like that. It's the whole part of making sure that your teams move to high performing teams, is that education piece, that continuous learning piece, and making sure that you share bad news. So oftentimes in organizations, when fraud occurs, we don't want to talk about it. It's bad. We are bad. And
Yep.
it shouldn't be that way. It should be like, hey, this is what we found. Here's the lessons learned. Here's some things we think we're going to work on. Anyone have any suggestions? And then you might have a
Hmm.
whole bunch of suggestions in terms of how things are processed, things that other individuals have seen. But fraud, same with even white collar fraud. Like if somebody was like a victim of fraud individually as a person, it's really difficult for them to report it to the police. Like it's one of those things that you just
Yeah.
don't, it's like, oh, I guess those things just happen, or I guess we just, pay for it and carry on. It's really difficult for organizations and individuals to get to the police, to do really constructive things around lessons learned and continuous learning, so that they can try and not do it anymore. Oftentimes they
Right.
just don't want to admit it occurred.
No, 100%. And here's the thing, like even if you have whistleblowers, they're not necessarily gonna, so money is one thing, right? Like if an organization loses money versus if an organization's practices are killing people, like the whistleblower is not necessarily gonna blow on the money.
That's
But
very true.
right? Because who cares? Like organizations have tons of money. You can afford to lose the money, but as soon as they start to like if it's a health risk, people are dying, then that really needs to be, so like they're more intent on
Yes.
stopping or speaking up in that regard.